Friday, 22nd of April, 10:30 in the morning, just north of Dublin, along the Boyne River, visiting some World Heritage Site, Neolithic burial grounds, and we'll listen in, I guess.
Now this is actually a much bigger, it's a much more complex site than Newgrange, and in 1962 the archaeologists started to excavate here, and the excavations continued for 40 years. And it was Professor George Ogan from University of Dublin that excavated this site. Now he found at least 12 different phases of activity, and the earliest evidence of activity dates from around 4000 BC. So when they excavated underneath some of these monuments, they found evidence of houses. They were quite large wooden rectangular structures, and these houses were at least 6,000 years old. So this tells us that people were living here at Knowth, and they were farming this land about 1,000 years before the passage tombs were built. So the monuments that you see here today, they're called passage graves or passage tombs. They date from around 3000 BC. They're 5,000 years old. That makes them about 500 years older than the pyramids of Giza in Egypt, and about 1,000 years older than Stonehenge in England. So they date from the Neolithic or the New Stone Age. And in this area, in the Boyne Valley, we have evidence for at least 40 of these tombs. So we have 3 of this size, Newgrange-Knowth and Douth, and they're surrounded by 37 smaller ones. And what's interesting here, there's a huge loop or a U-bend in the River Boyne. Within that curve, the 40 monuments were constructed. So the river must have been of great importance, great significance to the builders of the tombs. And perhaps they used the river to divide their village, their settlement on the other side, to their cemetery and the world of their deities over here. And the first display panel, this is just an artist's impression as to what this particular site would have looked like 5,000 years ago. So what Knowth consists of, we have one large mound. This mound covers an area of 1.5 acres. That's about 3/5 of a hectare. Now Newgrange, the mound there just covers about 1 acre. And at Newgrange you have one passage and one chamber. Here at Knowth we have 2. They lie back to back, facing east and west. So they face towards the rising and setting sun in March and September at the equinox, when we have equal day and equal night. And then we also found evidence for 18 of these small tombs, and as you see they're grouped right around the large one. And we know that at least 2 of these were actually built before the main mound. And it would appear that when the monuments were first built, their primary function was that they were used for burial, and that's simply because cremated remains were found inside. In most cases the remains are far too fragmentary for identification, so it really is impossible to say how many people were buried in each tomb, and also we don't know who the tombs were built for. But at the same time the site must have served as a focal point for the community, like our churches or temples today. A place of worship, a ritual centre, a meeting place. So a place where the people could gather at certain times of the year for ceremonies and for celebrations. And we suggest that these monuments were probably used for several hundred years. So that takes us then towards the beginning of the Bronze Age. And the Bronze Age started in Ireland around 2200 BC. The early Bronze Age is often referred to as the Beaker period, and the Beaker people just got their name from the type of pottery that they used, but they found some Beaker activity here. After the Beaker people, there seems to have been a gap of about 2,000 years. It's a very long period of time for this site to be left completely unoccupied. We don't know what happened, but there's very little Bronze Age activity here in the Boyne Valley. So that takes us then to the Iron Age, the early centuries AD. And at this time, Knowth again was used as a burial site. The people are no longer cremating their dead, and instead you find these inhumation burials, and 35 of these burials were found here. And just as the illustration shows you there, they dug pits in the ground, placed the body in a crouched or fetal position, and they were covered over with layers of stone and soil. And then subsequent to the burials, the mound was transformed into this fortified settlement. So you now have people living on top of the large mound. So this must have been someone of importance, a local chieftain, a socially significant family. These people needed protection. So you see they dug 2 ditches or trenches around the mound. So the site really was the equivalent to a very large ring fort. Now the top ditch just enclosed the summit, wouldn't have caused much damage. And then you have a very deep ditch dug at the base. So this bottom ditch was dug on the inside of the large curbstones. And to facilitate for the digging of the ditch, they had to cut off the east and west entrance, so they were completely destroyed. So this would have caused quite a lot of damage. It also gave these people access to the tombs, and Ogham writing was discovered inside. It's often pronounced as Ogham, but it's the earliest form of writing that we have. So that also dates from the Iron Age. Then between the 8th and 12th centuries, early Christian period, Ireland was now divided into about 150 different kingdoms. And one of the largest and most powerful of these was Northern Brega. The kings of Northern Brega resided here on Ireland. This is a very important political issue. We have evidence of 13 of these early Christian houses. Quite small, rectangular dwellings, but they had stone foundations and then wooden walls, thatched roof. Underneath 9 of the houses they found souterrains, and these are underground passages and tunnels. They would have used these for storage and for hiding, and you'll see some of the souterrains as you walk around. But also inside in the eastern tomb, 4 signatures were discovered. They're old Gaelic names: Conan, Temptnoth, Snedges and Garbleter. So these names are etched out on the stones inside. And it's graffiti, but dating from around the 9th century. And then the Normans invaded in the 12th century. They arrived in Ireland in 1169, and it was 1175 when they had actually arrived here at Knowth. And they set about constructing this motte and bailey type structure. And again, they chose to live on top of the large mound. So this was used as a fortress by the Normans during the Norman conquest of County Meath. During the excavations, the archaeologists found the foundations for this rectangular stone wall, and then inside the foundations for 2 small stone houses. But now we have mortar used in the construction. The houses have slated roofs instead of thatch. The walls of the houses are plastered on the inside. They're much more advanced than the previous structures. And we also think around this time, around the 12th, 13th century, there must have been a small church or an oratory with some kind of a religious building here, because they found stone water fountains, stained glass and also glazed tiles with the name Aria inscribed on them. But then from about the 14th century onwards, the site just was abandoned. There was limited habitation from then on. So it just became a grass-covered mound and was left then, that's the way it remained right through to the 1960s when the archaeologists started to excavate. So if you can imagine, 40 years ago, all that was here was the large mound. It was much lower than this. The material from this mound had just slipped out, and that had covered the foundations for all the small passage pits. So you just had one large grassy mound in the middle of the field. And then during the excavations they found evidence for all the different races, etc. And it was decided that the site should be restored, back to what it would have looked like in the Neolithic when the tombs were first built. So they had to rebuild all of the monuments that you see here this morning, and they used as much of the original material as was possible. But unfortunately we don't have access to the main passages and chambers here. It's just because people lived on top for so long, it put tremendous pressure on what was underneath. Many of the stones collapsed inside. You'd actually have to get down on your stomach. You'd have to crawl in for over 20 metres before you'd actually be able to get inside into the chambers. So these tombs will never be open to the public. It's just too dangerous. The only monument that you have access where you can go inside is at Newgrange. So is everything clear so far? It's hard to go through 6,000 years in about 5 minutes and not confuse anyone. But if you have any questions at the end of the tour, hopefully I'll be able to answer them for you. But we'll take a walk around and I'll point out various features then along the way. Is that okay? Yeah. So if we just move up